Persian Gulf waters 40 kilometers off the Iranian coast 9 in the morning. 14 fast attack boats were racing across the water toward USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, operating in international waters. 8 Iranian boats approached from the northeast, while 6 Russian boats closed in from the northwest, and all 14 vessels were traveling at high speed in a coordinated assault pattern. The carrier was accompanied by 2 U.S. warships, and radar operators had detected the approaching boats minutes earlier. The strike group commander immediately ordered battle stations, and within minutes the entire formation was at heightened alert. General quarters alarms sounded throughout all 3 ships, and sailors rushed to their combat positions. Weapon systems were brought online across the carrier and both U.S. warships. The 8 Iranian boats were approaching from the northeast at speeds exceeding 40 knots, creating large wakes as they raced toward the carrier. Each boat was approximately 50 ft long and painted in military colors with Iranian naval markings visible on their hulls. The boats carried heavy machine guns and rocket launchers, confirming they were military attack craft. Meanwhile, the 6 Russian boats approaching from the northwest were slightly larger, measuring approximately 60 ft in length. These boats displayed Russian flags and hull numbers that identified them as military vessels. The Russian boats stayed closer together compared to the Iranian boats and appeared to be coordinating their approach through radio communications. Like the Iranian boats, the Russian vessels were traveling at high speeds and were clearly timing their approach to arrive at the carrier at the same time with their Iranian partners. This level of coordination between Russian and Iranian naval forces was highly unusual and suggested that the attack had been planned in advance. Intelligence analysts aboard the carrier quickly assessed that this represented a dangerous situation, as Iranian and Russian naval forces did not typically conduct joint operations in these waters. The coordination between the 2 groups suggested planning and preparation rather than a spontaneous encounter or routine naval exercise. The analysts also noted that the boats were approaching from 2 different directions, with the 2 groups positioned to split the carrier strike group's defensive fire. This attack plan indicated professional military planning. The carrier strike group commander authorized defensive warnings to be broadcast to the approaching boats using multiple communication methods. Radio operators transmitted messages on international maritime frequencies in both English and Farsi, warning that the boats were approaching a U.S. naval formation, conducting lawful operations in international waters, and ordering them to change course immediately to avoid being treated as hostile forces. The warnings were repeated multiple times and broadcast on different frequencies to ensure the boat crews would receive them. The messages made clear that continued approach would be interpreted as hostile intent and could result in defensive action being taken to protect the carrier. The boats ignored all warnings and continued their high-speed approach toward the carrier without any acknowledgement of the radio calls or any change in course. The Iranian boats were now 15 nautical miles from Abraham Lincoln and closing rapidly, while the Russian boats were approximately 18 nautical miles out and also maintaining their inbound course toward the carrier. The carrier air wing commander ordered 2 Fa-18 Super Hornets that were already airborne on combat patrol to investigate the approaching boats and make a show of force. The fighters descended from their patrol altitude and conducted high-speed passes over both groups of boats at low altitude, flying directly over the vessels at speeds exceeding 400 knots. The fighters made multiple passes, clearly displaying their weapons, including air-to-surface missiles, and attempting to demonstrate U.S. resolve to defend the carrier through this aggressive but non-lethal response. The roar of the jet engines at low altitude and the sight of the armed fighters overhead should have made clear to the boat crews that they were facing overwhelming military force. However, the boats did not alter course despite the fighter presence overhead and the repeated warnings. Radio intercepts indicated that Iranian and Russian commanders were communicating with each other, in what appeared to be coordinated attack planning, discussing timing to ensure both groups would reach attack range at the same time and could engage the carrier from multiple directions at once. At 9:00, with the boats now within 10 nautical miles and still closing at high speed, the strike group commander made the critical decision to engage with defensive fire. The approaching boats represented a serious threat to the carrier based on their speed, armament, coordination, refusal to respond to warnings, and continued approach despite multiple attempts to deter them. Under the rules of engagement, the boat's behavior showed hostile intent and justified the use of force to defend the carrier and its crew. The commander authorized weapons free, giving the U.S. warships permission to engage the boats with all available weapon systems. The two U.S. warships immediately began moving to position themselves between the approaching boats and the carrier, establishing a defensive screen that would allow them to engage threats at maximum range. Both ships increased speed and moved to best firing positions that gave their gun systems clear fields of fire toward both groups of attacking boats. The U.S. warships' weapon systems had been tracking the boats since they were first detected, and fire control computers had already calculated firing solutions, accounting for range, target speed, and sea conditions. The gun crews were ready to fire on command with ammunition loaded and targeting systems locked onto their assigned targets. At 8 nautical miles, the U.S. warships opened fire with their rapid-fire cannons. The 76 guns could fire 120 rounds per minute, with computer-controlled aiming that calculated lead angles and adjusted for the boat's speed and maneuvers, and they began engaging the Iranian boats first as these represented the closer threat. The gun systems locked onto their targets and began firing in controlled bursts designed to maximize accuracy while conserving ammunition. Each shell was a high-explosive round capable of destroying a small boat with a single direct hit or causing severe damage with a near miss. The initial salvo created massive water spouts around the lead Iranian boats as shells impacted near their targets, sending columns of spray dozens of feet into the air. Gunners observed the impacts and quickly adjusted aim to hit the boats directly. The second salvo scored hits with high-explosive shells striking 2 boats in quick succession. The shells penetrated the thin fiberglass hulls before detonating inside the boats, creating massive damage that no small vessel could survive. The first boat to be hit disintegrated as multiple shells penetrated its hull and detonated almost at the same time, creating a series of explosions that consumed the small vessel. The boat's fuel tanks ignited and added to the destruction, creating a large fireball. The boat began sinking immediately, going under in less than 30 seconds, with crew members who survived the initial explosions jumping into the water to escape. A second Iranian boat took multiple shell hits along its length and was torn apart by the explosions. The lightweight fiberglass construction offered no protection against the explosive rounds, and the boat literally broke into pieces that scattered across the water. The broken bow section floated briefly before it too began to sink. The remaining Iranian boats attempted to scatter and evade the defensive fire, but the computer-controlled targeting systems tracked them efficiently. A third boat was struck by shells that destroyed its engines and neutralized the crew operating the weapon systems. While the U.S. warships engaged the Iranian boats, 2 helicopters launched from Abraham Lincoln's deck and flew at low altitude toward the Russian boats approaching. From the northwest, the helicopters were armed with door-mounted machine guns and rocket pods, providing mobile defensive firepower that could engage threats from angles the U.S. warships could not easily cover. The helicopter crews had trained extensively for defending carriers against swarm attacks from small boats, and they executed their procedures with precision. Each helicopter carried a gunner manning a machine gun and a pilot capable of firing the rocket pods mounted on the aircraft's sides. Russian boats maintained their approach despite witnessing the destruction being caused to their Iranian partners. The boat commanders appeared determined to press the attack regardless of the defensive fire they would face, demonstrating either courage or reckless disregard for the overwhelming firepower facing them. As the helicopters closed to firing range, the Russian boats began taking evasive action, weaving back and forth to make targeting more difficult. However, the helicopter crews had the advantage of altitude and could observe the boats' movements from above, making it difficult for the boats to escape the battle area. At 6 nautical miles, the helicopters opened fire on the Russian boats with door-mounted machine guns. The 7.62 rounds struck the lead boats in long bursts, damaging hulls, destroying equipment, and forcing evasive movements that disrupted their tight formation. The boats separated and began taking individual courses toward the carrier, rather than maintaining coordinated movement. One helicopter pilot identified 3 Russian boats traveling close together and decided to engage them with rockets rather than machine gun fire. He lined up the shot and fired 4 rockets from the pods mounted on his aircraft's side. The rockets streaked toward the boats and impacted near them, creating large explosions and pressure waves. The rockets impacted in the water close to the boats, creating massive geysers and underwater shock waves that damaged the lightweight hulls. One boat took a direct hit that penetrated the hull and exploded inside, creating a fireball that consumed the entire vessel. The boat sank within seconds with no survivors visible in the water. The other 2 boats in the group were severely damaged by the near misses, with hulls cracked and engines disabled. Both vessels were left dead in the water, unable to continue their attack or attempt escape. The helicopter gunner then engaged these disabled boats with machine gun fire to ensure they posed no further threat. The U.S. warships now shifted some of their fire to the Russian boats while continuing to engage the surviving Iranian vessels. Fire control officers coordinated the targeting to ensure both groups of attackers were being engaged at the same time, preventing either from reaching firing range. The coordinated defensive fire from both surface ships and helicopters created an overwhelming volume of firepower that the small attack boats could not survive or evade. The boats had no armor protection, limited defensive capabilities, and were exposed to attack from multiple directions at once. A 4th Iranian boat was hit by a sustained burst of cannon fire from one of the U.S. warships. Multiple shells struck the boat in rapid succession, and one penetrated the fuel tanks, creating a massive explosion. The detonation was so powerful it indicated that the boat had been carrying additional explosives or ammunition that added to the destruction. The explosion created a large fireball visible across several miles of ocean, and debris was thrown hundreds of feet into the air. A 5th Iranian boat attempted to turn away and retreat when its commander realized the attack had failed, but the U.S. warship's targeting system tracked it during the turn and continued firing. The boat was struck by shells that destroyed its engine compartment, leaving it motionless in the water. Follow-up fire ensured the boat was completely neutralized. The Russian boats attempted to continue their attack despite the losses, with remaining vessels pushing forward at maximum speed. However, the helicopter and U.S. warship fire proved too accurate and too heavy for the small boats to overcome. At 4 nautical miles, the U.S. warship scored multiple hits on Russian boats, with 2 vessels being struck by shells in rapid succession. Both boats were destroyed, their burning hulls marking the extent of their advance toward the carrier. The remaining Iranian boats, now reduced to just 2 vessels from the original 8, attempted to turn away and retreat toward Iranian waters. However, the U.S. warships maintained radar lock on both boats and continued engaging them as they withdrew, preventing any escape from the battle area. One retreating Iranian boat was hit by a concentrated salvo of shells that destroyed its engine and steering systems, leaving it dead in the water. The boat began taking on water and listing to one side as its hull filled. The second boat managed to travel several hundred meters before it, too, was struck by accurate cannon fire and disabled, its crew abandoning the sinking vessel. The last two Russian boats also attempted to withdraw when they saw their coordinated attack had completely failed and that all their companion boats had been destroyed. The boat commanders reversed course and attempted to flee at maximum speed, but the helicopters pursued them and continued the engagement. One fleeing Russian boat was hit by helicopter rockets that impacted directly on the vessel, creating an explosion that lifted the boat partially out of the water before it crashed back down and began sinking. The final boat attempted evasive movements while retreating, weaving back and forth to avoid being targeted, but a U.S. warship fired to this last threat and engaged it with sustained cannon fire. The final Russian boat was struck by multiple shells in rapid succession that tore the small vessel apart, and minutes later, the damaged boat broke into pieces and quickly sank. The entire engagement had lasted approximately 25 minutes, and all 14 attack boats had been destroyed through U.S. warship cannon fire and helicopter weapons. Abraham Lincoln and both warships emerged without any damage, while American casualties were zero. Iranian and Russian losses were estimated at approximately 60 soldiers from the boat crews.